Tonight we look at two stories shaping the global debate on power, prosperity and the future of our societies. In our first segment, we examine the widening rift between Washington and Brussels over how pressure Moscow to end its war in Ukraine. Should the West lean on tariffs targeting third parties like China and India, as the White House proposes, or double down on direct sanctions against the criminal, as Europe prefers? We'll explore what's at stake for transatlantic unity, energy markets, and the prospects for ending the conflict. Then, in our second segment, we step back to discuss a quieter but equally profound issue: the global fertility slowdown. Some warn of economic stagnation and social strain as populations age and shrink. Others say innovation, longer lifespans, and smarter policy can help societies adapt without panic. I'm Rana Al-Khassas, and this is In Focus. Foreign policy highlights a new divide in the Western response to Russia's war. U.S. President Donald Trump's administration is urging G7 partners to impose meaningful tariffs on Chinese and Indian imports, arguing that these countries' purchases of Russian oil bankroll Putin's war machine. The White House insists that such duties, paired with the seizure of frozen Russian assets, would squeeze Moscow within deepening direct sanctions. Brussels, meanwhile, is finalizing its 19th package of traditional sanctions, wary that tariffs could backfire on consumers if derailed trade talks with India. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has repeatedly stressed that tariffs are taxes, signaling EU resistance. This dispute isn't just technical, it cuts to the heart of how the West coordinates strategy, balances domestic politics, and keeps pressure on Russia without splintering its own alliance. Joining us now from Florida is our distinguished guest, Justin Thomas Russell, Executive Director of the Global Foreign Policy Center, to unpack how this tariff versus sanctions clash may shape the war in Ukraine and the durability of transatlantic solidarity. A very warm welcome, sir, to In Focus, and it's a pleasure always to have you with us as our very distinguished guest. Mr. Russell, how significant is the split between Washington and Brussels on strategy toward Russia?
Well, it's always good to see you, Raina, as always. It's a delicate balance is what's happening here. Ursula von der Leyen has been very clear that her concern is that when you talk about secondary sanctions, basically you're just talking about tariffs. And the people who tend to pay for tariffs are the domestic consumer. She said that, she was quoted in the foreign policy article that you referenced. She's made that clear several times when the issue of secondary sanctions come up. But the problem is, when you talk about the funding of the Russian assault on Ukraine, the entire world knows that this is being funded by energy and its petroleum sales, and the biggest clients you're talking about, China, India, Eastern Europe, the Baltic. Some of the biggest clients are also some of our biggest trading partners here in the United States and in Europe. So it's a very delicate balance.
What are the main drivers behind the White House's preference for tariffs over direct sanctions? Or is it a means for Donald Trump to postpone sanctions on Russia at this point, sir?
So here's what we've got to realize here, Raina, and this is where the argument kind of stems from. Is one man's sanctions are another man's tariffs. Whether you want whatever you want to call them, it's not the term that you use, it's the effectiveness of it being able to put financial restrictions and financial controls over who who gives the one being sanctioned or the one being tariffed their money, how much are they getting, and how much are they going to be able to use that money. The terminology here is not important. The larger argument, and this is where the focus needs to be, is the focus needs to be very clear on the idea that, sanctioning Russian oil is not going to work. It is backing and fully supporting the Ukrainians in defense of their sovereignty. That's where the money needs to go, and that's where the money needs to be focused, quite frankly.
Sir, you nailed it, of course, and I really appreciate and respect your answer. How does Europe's approach reflect its own economic and political constraint?
Well, the European approach is complicated. Like everything else that we're talking about in this particular arena, it is very complicated. What you're dealing with is you're dealing with a European, a series of European state governments that have to rely on energy coming from eastern boundaries of their area, in particular Russia. And as a result, if you start putting pressure on them, where are they going to source their other energy? Who's going to step up? Is that source of energy going to be more expensive? Well, if those prices go up on energy, well, then the prices on domestic goods, the cost of living, inflation starts happening. So then there's on the central government to deal with that. So Europe is kind of caught in the middle of wanting back and support and protect themselves from Russian aggression. At the same time, how do they keep the lights on? That's a big question. That's something that Europe is dealing with on a daily basis right now. And I think that's part of the concern of why there's a hesitancy to start just, basic blockading Russian energy supplies.
Mr. Russell, I see now at this point, and I want to know from you your narrative that Donald Trump is pressuring on the impossible at this point because if Russia stops giving the Europeans oil and gas, then they're in deep trouble. And if Donald Trump continues threatening what he's threatening and put tariffs, put sanctions, whatever, you said no terminology in this context. So how does he want it to go? How does and what does he expect? He expects Europe to abide to what he wants. He expects Russia to abide to what he wants in his own context. What exactly does he want?
Raina, that is a great question. And the reality is, I'm not sure that Donald Trump really knows what he wants. That's the problem. It, I think that his
When will
strategy,
he
when it
know what
comes
he
to
wants, Mr. Wassel?
Raina, that is probably an infinite question for the universe that even the universe can't answer. It is, there have been ample opportunities for Donald Trump to clarify and solidify his position when it comes to the Ukrainian question. It has been convoluted it has been confusing most times. In one instance, you see Donald Trump literally getting into an arguing, screaming match in the Oval Office with Vladimir Zelensky during a bilateral discussion. And then the next point, he's got Vladimir Zelensky being received in the same Oval Office just months later as one of his best friends and a true purveyor of democracy.
True, everything in its opposite. Do you read it like this, sir?
Well, here's the thing. This is never good for establishing a series of foreign policies. Uh, Look, I've been on your show and I've been on with you many, many times, Raina, and you know I'm not a huge fan of the Donald Trump foreign policy.
I know, sir.
The reality is now we're getting to a point where I think even the Trump administration is starting to see that they perhaps have been played by Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin's the sanctions against Vladimir Putin have arguably not been effective. The assault continues to maintain, if not grow, as we've seen in the past 7 to 14 days. And the problem then becomes that if the initial sanctions aren't working, if he is still able to get funding to fund his war machine, and the damage is not only being maintained but increasing in Ukraine, then what is the solution? The only solution here is something that Donald Trump does not want to view. He is not supportive of NATO putting boots on the ground, which Poland has suggested and other NATO partners have suggested. They have not been aggressive, or they are hesitant to be aggressive from a NATO standpoint against Russia, fearing possible escalation. And Donald Trump, quite frankly, doesn't want to lose face with Vladimir Putin, even though Vladimir Putin kind of caused him to lose face during the Alaska meetings when he's sitting there talking about peace and his defense forces are in fact attacking Kyiv at the same time.
But he's talking about peace because of his own personal interests, sir.
Again, Irina, his interest is to expand the sphere of influence of Russia. His goal is to make the Stalin Soviet Union the current state of the Russian Federation. Look, he's an old school KGB spy master. He's going to act like that, and he's going to do whatever he can to, one, maintain power, two, expand Russian dominance, not only in the region, but globally. And quite frankly, he's made it clear he wants to be the superpower, and he's going to do whatever it takes for him to become that.
How might these debates affect global energy flows, especially given China and India's demand for Russian oil, sir?
Raina, that's an interesting question. My guess is that what we're going to see is we're going to see pressure on OPEC. You know, does OPEC truly step up and, you know, meet the mark by, you know, having enough production, enough capability, enough product to be able to offset the Russian energy supply? There are also other avenues here. You know, one great one that, you know, that kind of plays into Donald Trump's kind of playbook is the idea of, look, U.S. energy independence is here. There is no longer a reliance on foreign energy supplies for the U.S. to maintain its current energy requirements. In fact, some are arguing that there's even a surplus of energy that could be exported to what would be considered Russian customers. That could offset the need. So there are several things. I don't think anybody's done a real deep dive on it, but the bigger question is the economics. How much does it cost to to produce and export it to the current client base? You know, can we effectively do it for the same amount of money to get, for example, U.S. energy products or Canadian energy or even any Western Hemisphere energy products from our hemisphere over to places like India, Japan, the Baltics? Can we do it as cost effectively as they currently can do with the current Russian energy supply? The answer, from what I'm hearing in my experience, has been it's going to be tough. You've got greater distances, more shipping requirements, whether it's over ocean, through pipelines, to ships. There's a lot of complex transportation that's required to get the energy to the consumer, but I think it still needs to be looked at very closely.
Sir, are there risks that tariffs on third parties could trigger retaliation or weaken support for Ukraine among emerging economies, considering and putting into consideration, sir, that of course the United States is one of the biggest, of course, countries that are gaining from the minerals in Ukraine, and of course they are using them.
I I gotta be honest. I'm not a big fan of this bargaining chip of the raw materials that's being used in the defense of Ukraine, or as an argument in the defense of Ukraine. It just gives the appearance of it being transactional. I mean, yeah, I'm not naive. I know that that's going to be a factor in various. I mean, heck, Donald Trump tried using that ineffectively, I would
It is,
argue. Um,
Mr. Russell, he bargains over everything.
well, you're not wrong there. But what I will say is that you know the idea of using the raw materials inside Ukraine as a transactional bargaining chip, I get very uncomfortable with that. Here's why: because then all we're doing is just making independence, democracy, and legal sovereignty a betting chip. It's a transactional. It's more transactional than fundamental, and that's a concern. When we start talking about the quid pro quo of backing down or backing or providing defense support for a country that we've considered an ally and even considered bringing into NATO, but only backing them to an extent that until they make a deal with us on the raw materials, that becomes quite awkward. Now, what I will say, and there is a slight exception, that if there was some sort of an agreement where NATO allies could in fact offset their energy requirements by using some of the raw materials in Ukraine to help stem possible inflation. I think I have a lot of heartburn with that, but we've got to look at that very closely, because that could become a very slippery slope if we do it that way.
Mr. Russell, what steps can Western leaders take to keep unity intact while maximizing pressure on the Kremlin?
I would like to hope that that answer, if NATO could come up with that answer easily, they would have
So
done that.
you want NATO to come up with this answer, not you?
Yeah. Trust me, if I could come up with that answer, I'd be putting myself in for the Nobel
Okay,
Prize.
I'll ask you another question, sir. Sir, don't you see that what's taking place all over the entire global world at this point is making the United States and U.S. President Donald Trump lose credibility?
This is a very difficult question to answer.
It's not difficult, Mr. Russell.
As an American, as somebody who has to balance, somebody that has to balance, one, as a former member of the United States military and law enforcement in the United States, at the same time as being somebody who has to give objective analysis and provide research that has global impact from a foreign policy center aspect. It's a very difficult question for me to answer. The simple answer is, and I've said it before publicly, and I don't have a problem saying it here now, is that yes, the answer is we are losing credibility. We are losing credibility economically by having the BRICS alliance and the Shanghai Cooperative Organization. BRICS and SCO are very distinct threats to the credibility and the influence that the U.S. has, over the global policy. We are losing ground strategically We saw that happen. Everything from not 100% backing our ally in Ukraine to even some of the tension that has arisen from the recent Israeli attack on Doha in Qatar. Uh, that affects our credibility. There's a lot of issues that we're having to deal with now. Is that because of the fact that it is I want to use an ignorance on the part of the Trump administration on how they view foreign policy? Is it stubbornness because they believe that the America First policy is going to make America better? Or is it a matter of that we're in a changing global environment and this is a cyclical time? And as we've seen through the history of geopolitical differences, empires come, empires fall, and that this may be a time that we're losing ground.
I really thank you, Justin Thomas Russell, and I really wanted this interview to be longer because always it's interesting interviewing you and taking answers and debating me and you together. It's my pleasure. This is, of course, thank you very much for sharing your insights and helping us understand what's going on in this very critical debate. And we move on to, as the West debates tools of pressure and deterrence, another challenge looms: how societies will adapt to a world where populations may peak and then shrink. What does the demographic change mean for growth, labor markets, and culture, and how should governments prepare? A recent economist analysis argues that the so-called global fertility crash is real, but not necessarily catastrophic. Fertility rates are now below replacement in two-thirds of countries, from Bugatti to Tokyo, prompting warnings about aging populations and slower innovations. Yet the article reminds us that Japan, despite 2 decades of population decline, has seen living standards increase. Longer lifespans, better education, and advances in AI and automation could cushion the impact. The real tax is adaptation, rethinking pensions, labor, participation, and how to make the most of every generation's potential. Joining us is Meher Nicholas Ferzilli, Director General of the World Pensions Forum, to discuss how governments and markets should respond to demographic change without succumbing to alarmism. Mr. Ferzilli, a very warm welcome to In Focus. And how serious is the global fertility downturn for long-term economic stability?
I'm delighted to join you today. It's a great topic. It's a very important topic, which is often neglected. And why do people, policymakers, the media neglect it? It's something which will have consequences on the economy in 10, 15, 20 years, right? And so because the election cycle is every 4 years, because the news cycle is every day or every hour, because the financial cycle is every minute on the stock exchange, something which will have a big impact in 15, 20, 30 years usually gets pushed under the rug, right? I suspect now we're hearing that, we're hearing more and more about that, saying that, look, there is in many countries a collapse of the birth rate, right? Like South Korea and Japan, as you mentioned, but also Italy, also Poland, Russia, etc. And some people now are saying, you know what, it's not bad, which I think is wrong. But who are they? So who is saying, you know what, it's not bad, it may be something good? They are, typically the World Economic Forum Davos people, right? And so who are these Davos, neocon intellectuals and policy thinkers, there are people who for 50 years preach the gospel of free market and open borders fetishism. So they said for 50 years, we can wave the magic wand of modern capitalism at any problem, economic, industrial, cultural, and if you just wave the magic wands of open borders and free markets, you will solve your problems. And now, of course,
how will the problems be solved, Mr. Frizzelli?
but that was the dominant ideology of the Davos, neoliberal, neocon people. And of course, with Donald Trump in the White House, with Chairman Xi Jinping strengthening his central power in Beijing, so China and America now, they both have an interest to get rid of that Davos neocon ideology. So the only ones clinging desperately to that discourse are the Europeans. They say, oh, we still believe in that free market gospel. The Chinese and Trump, they're wrong. And look at economic growth now. Look at unemployment, inflation in Germany, France, Britain. It's quite bad. So the macroeconomic news coming out of Berlin, Paris, and London are bad. They have been bad for a long time. Economic growth, the most important indicator, which is linked to birth rate, it's linked to fertility, it's linked to the number of children per woman, right? GDP growth in the UK, France, and Germany is much lower than the rest of the world. And so basically the ideas of the Davos, neocon ideologues are failing. So now they are trying to reinvent themselves. And they are reinventing themselves as eco-friendly progressivists. They say that, they need more social control. And they say they need to control the birth rate of women in Catholic and Muslim countries because, Muslim and Catholic women have too many children. And they say that, if we lower the birth rate, it's great because then the world will use less fossil fuels, the world will use less energy, so there will be less pollution, blah, blah, blah. So they're using as a pretext.
And there will be less people, sir. There will not be a world.
So exactly. They're using as a pretext in a very hypocritical way or stupid way, but it doesn't matter if they're hypocrites or stupid. And they say, listen, we have less children, therefore we use less coal, oil and gas, less pollution. So Mother Nature is happy. In reality, what they seek is social control, because if you control the birth rate of women in Latin America and the Middle East, then you are impacting culture and society, right? You as a policymaker are destroying what? Traditional family values.
True, sir, which is the most important thing we're supposed to be focusing on at this point.
Of course. So that's why it's very dangerous. So when these people say, oh, it's great, look at Japan and South Korea, it's true that the average South Korean or Japanese woman, she has had only 1.1 child, blah, 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 for the past 20 years. But look, the economy of Japan is doing okay. Actually, that's a lie. That's a lie because the economy of Japan is not doing okay. And one of the reasons why there is subpar, slow economic growth in Japan is precisely because Japanese women don't have enough children, and there's something called the old age dependency ratio. What does it mean?
Mr. Frizzelli, because I ran out of time, and I'm very sorry because I wanted to really discuss this with you more in depth. So I promised you another episode that we're going to be continuing this special topic. And of course, sir, I thank you for that thoughtful analysis that we didn't take much time, sorry. But I promise you, and for shedding light on how societies can meet this challenge with resilience and innovation, and they will probably, because every family will do whatever it wants to do, and every country has its own culture and traditions. It will go after whether orders or whether whatever imposes on them. Every family and every tradition and every culture and every country has its own means.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much, sir.
Cheers.
From the fierce debate over how to stop Russia's war to the long-term questions about demographic change, tonight's discussions remind us that policy choices ripple far beyond headlines. Whether settling tariffs or redesigning pensions, governments must weigh costs, incentives, and the shared interests that bind nations together. That is all for In Focus in this episode. I'm Rana Al-Qassas. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time to continue this topic. Thank you very much for watching.